Well, think about that word composition. It sounds like compose, and I mean that's exactly what it is. You think about a composer, who's writing a piece of music. They think about, the rhythm that they want to have in the music. They think about, if they want to have lots and lots of notes, lots of melodies, or if they want to have things kind of scaled back and have things nice and peaceful. They think about the arrangement of the music. They think about how many instruments are going to go in, whether it's going to be a lot or whether it's going to be only a few, and so on. This is not a million miles away from this idea of composition when it comes to photography and indeed with art. We are composers of our photographs. We decide what goes into the frame and what gets left out of the frame. We're making a very conscious decision about what goes into the frame, what we're deciding that we want to show and express to the viewer. And that is what composition is. The recipe for good compositions, to get very quickly started, things to look out for is that you want to look out for lines. You want to look out for shapes. You want to look for form. And form is the configuration of something. It's how it's made up. Like, for example, a flower. We appreciate the beauty of a flower. We appreciate its form. Textures. So we look out for textures, patterns, colours, anything that's kind of visually interesting, and space, perhaps the most important of all, lighting. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have good quality lighting in your photographs. It's the difference between having something that's kind of average to something that's extraordinary, like with that photograph we saw at the very start, Bliss. To help with our composition, as I mentioned, there's a couple of guidelines that we can follow, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with a lot of these already. We're not going to explore all of them because there's loads, but I'm going to look at the ones that I feel are the most important that you can start to use straight away to improve your compositions instantly, and that will add to your skills, will give you just something that you can use when you're out there if you're just struggling to find the shot. Now, something to also be aware of if you are struggling to find the photograph is that you're not going to get it first time. You need to explore your subject. So whatever it is you have decided to photograph, it's very unlikely that you're going to take a photograph, you're going to be at the right height, in the right place, with the lighting just perfect in one go. You have to explore the subject. The way to think about it is you are an explorer. Photographs are hidden and you are just trying to reveal them, you're just trying to find them, and that is what we try to do as photographers. Let's have a look at some examples of this. So this is so cool. So this is a contact sheet from Masayoshi Tsukita and David Bowie, 1977, when he was doing the shoots for his album Heroes, and this is a contact sheet from that, and it's just terrific to see the kind of process here. You can see the marks on the contact sheet. So contact sheets were this great thing where we used to lay down negatives directly onto photographic paper, and we were able to expose that paper then using the light, and we were able to create our contact sheet. And we were able to then, mark the images that we felt that we were going to print. So rather than printing off every single image from a roll of film, we just did this instead. A lot of people still do this to see which ones should be used. So you can see the kind of blue marks here on the potential shots, and it's kind of interesting to see what you consider these as being outtakes. Then you very much see the one that he decided to use, which is, of course, the photograph that was chosen in the end, being marked out. But it's so interesting just to see this. And obviously Bowie was incredibly used to being photographed as well, very aware of himself, and trying out these kind of different looks and that. It's just terrific. Somebody here as well, another incredibly famous photograph, Dorothea Lange's The Migrant Mother series. So perhaps one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. And you can see there's a couple of different versions. There's more to this story than just this single photograph. And I mean, these photographs are interesting in their own right, but they are nowhere near as strong as this truly iconic shot. So you can kind of see again the process here that was going on, that was happening, with this shot and with this series. And just two examples of the fact that you are not going to get the photograph in one. You need to explore, you need to interact, you need to communicate, with your subject as well. And at the same time, you also need to become invisible. So if you are photographing people in general, that they become relaxed and they become vulnerable. And that's what there is in this series. There's a huge amount of vulnerability in that shot. So with that in mind, let's have a look at some compositional guidelines that we can use to improve our photographs. And the first one, you've probably come across it before, known as the rule of thirds. Now, it's not strictly a rule. As I mentioned, it is a guideline. There are no rules that you have to follow as such when it comes to composition. It is good to know of these guidelines. This is one that I use all the time myself. It's a really good fallback, and it's a really good place to start really when you are beginning to compose a photograph, the rule of thirds. So let's have a look at it in action. So let's break down this photograph. So with this shot, there's quite a lot going on here in terms of its composition. We can see here, we've got this kind of tonality happening through the shot. We have this kind of nice, very dark, contrasty image at the start. At the front here, the silhouette, I should say. And then we've kind of got this contrast that's kind of fading off in the mountains in the background. But look at the placement of the elements here in this photograph. We've got this kind of the end of this pier here with this kind of lighthouse or just pillar. We have this person sitting here, we have this person walking away, and we've got the lamps. Now, if we were to apply the rule of thirds to this is what we see. So basically, the rule of thirds it breaks down the photograph into 9 different sections, okay? And we want to try and arrange the photograph so that the main elements of the photograph fall somewhere either along these lines, along the vertical axes, or along the horizontal axes. And I got that mixed up, but I mean, so the horizontal axis obviously going across and the verticals going down. So as you can see, they don't have to fall exactly, where these kind of points intersect, but if they are quite close to them, it does help to balance out the photograph. So the rule of thirds. Very often, if you play around with the display option on your cameras, on your phones, you are going to see this grid come up, and it's just to help you to visualize it so that you can use it to compose. But you want to basically have your subjects somewhere falling near these lines, whether it's the horizontal line, whether it's the vertical line, or perhaps it's at the cross section of both. Let's have a look at a few more examples of this. So try to imagine the rule of thirds here. So obviously we've shot this in portrait format rather than landscape format, so we've shot it vertically, but you can almost see it straight away. You can just tell that the seal's head here just popping out from the water, it's like it's logically placed within the shot. If it was a central composition, probably wouldn't look too good. So if we apply our rule of thirds here, we can see the seal's head falls very much along that vertical and horizontal point. Okay, so there's a logical placement to it. It works with portraits as well. Absolutely, you can use it for portraits, and we don't also have to fill the frame, for this to work. So again, you can almost visualize it. You can imagine that grid in front of this photograph, and this gentleman placed towards the right hand part of the shot, and he's very much falling along that vertical line over on the right hand side. And we've got space here, but it doesn't look too empty. It looks well balanced, and again, there's just a certain logic to the placement of the person in this photograph by using the rule of thirds. We can also do this again, of course, with a portrait that's shot in portrait format as well. Here we've got a great example of it because the photographer has used light to create that kind of dark, that edge there instead. And again, you can see there's just kind of a logical placement there, with the positioning of this model, and the use of light here is very, very strong. So I recommend that if you haven't got it switched on and you're having some difficulty visualizing it, do switch on using the display or the info button on your cameras, the rule of thirds grids, so you can help better arrange the elements in your photograph. So remember, you want your subjects to be kind of falling either along the vertical or the horizontal lines, or perhaps even along the points where they intersect as well. Some other compositional techniques to have a look at, this one's a lot more straightforward, is symmetry. Symmetry. So pretty self-explanatory. Symmetry is when we have things that are symmetrical. They look the same on the right and the left hand side, or the top and the bottom. Okay, so obviously this is a shot of the Brooklyn Bridge. I was there myself, have a very similar photograph to this. This isn't my one exactly, but I do have one very, very similar to it. It's a great location for symmetry. Let's have a look at another example. So here we've got the Eiffel Tower, and as you can see here, I've just overlaid this kind of symmetrical kind of grid here. So this is a good example of symmetry both on the top and the bottom and on the left and the right hand side. So we've got this symmetry happening with the reflection of the Eiffel Tower in the water, but we've also kind of got this symmetry happening right down the middle as well. And you know, the way this is just designed, like the garden is designed and the architecture is designed, it is already very symmetrical. So we've kind of got this repetition happening on both sides. So look out for symmetrical objects when you're out there photographing. Let's have a look at another example. So here, it isn't as obvious, but it is still symmetrical. And, you know, architecture in general is great, you know, for doing symmetrical photography. So we haven't got symmetry going across the top and the bottom, but we certainly have it going across from the left and the right, you know, right down the middle here. You know, we've composed this photograph and we've got symmetry on the left and on the right. Now, another very well-known compositional tool are leading lines, and these are great and they're pretty self-explanatory as well. As you can also see here visually with this photograph, we're being very much led into the shot, pretty much literally in this picture. Let's have a look at some examples. Basically, with leading lines, we want to try and photograph something that brings us to a point, that essentially takes us on a journey. So we're the viewer and we want to be taken on a journey through the photograph, you know, whether that's from the left to the right or something off in the distance. So let's have a look at this. We can very much see the leading lines in this shot because we've just got this bridge going right across and it brings us up to this point in the distance. We can also just see that very far away American flag. So it's just bringing us you know, through the shot where everything kind of converges into a point. So our eyes are being led through the image. So as a photographer, we've made a very conscious decision here on where we want to draw the viewer's eye to. Let's have a look at another terrific example here. Really nice long exposure shot here on Westminster Bridge. And again, try to identify the leading lines in this. So there's quite a few of them, you know, so let's break it down. So we have the bridge. So the bridge is bringing us through. We also have this kind of center, just a curve here. This is bringing us right through along these double yellow lines, or they look double red there. We have a lot of lines here because we also have the road markings. We have, of course, this bus that's going by here as well. It has to be a bus given the size of it. And all of these are creating lines which are bringing us right through the shot and bringing us to the center point of this photograph. And obviously then our eyes would be very much drawn and finishing here, you know, at Big Ben. So leading lines, it helps to get quite low when you're doing this type of photography, you know, because you can just get those like pathways, those curves like you can see here in this shot, and just draw the viewer's eye to a center point. Now, I've also mentioned another important compositional element a couple of times now here as well, and this is balance. Now, balance is a little bit trickier to understand than our kind of compositional guidelines, but balanced photographs are photographs that feel like all the elements that are in them have been arranged correctly, that our eyes are not getting lost in the photograph, or that our eyes don't know where to look. And it's a tricky one, but the best thing to do is to have a look at an example of it. So take a second to have a look at this photograph. Okay, so just think about where your eyes are going in this shot. Okay, so if we were to take a second to have a look at it, most likely our eyes are being drawn here. to this lighthouse. Obviously, it is a point of interest in the shot, but the image has balance. So when we're actually looking at the photograph, we're probably also coming down along to the rocks here at the front. We have these really dark rocks over here on the left hand side, and our eyes come back over to the lighthouse. So we take in the entire image. So we're having a look at the shot, and our eyes just feel like they're enjoying the whole photograph, and it just looks aesthetically pleasing. Let's remove one of the elements here. Let's do something like lost, and the island disappears. Okay, so any Lost fans out there, you'll know what I'm speaking about. So we've removed the island. Now look at the photograph again, and what do you think? Where are your eyes going now this time? So just pop it into Morpheus there. Where are your eyes being drawn to now in this photograph? And my eyes are very much being drawn over to the left hand side here, because tonally these rocks, as well as being heavy in real life, they also are very, very heavy, just tonally, just visually, because they're much darker. And so our eyes end up being drawn over there, and the image, it just doesn't work anymore. It's not balanced anymore. It's gone very heavy on the left hand side. So if we bring back the island reappears again, and we find that the balance has been restored. We find that our eyes go around the entire shot here again, and they're not just being drawn over to the left hand side. Now, balance doesn't always have to be just the arrangement of the compositional elements in the photograph. It can also be tonal balance. So here's a very famous photograph by a very famous photographer, probably the most famous photographer of the 20th century, Ansel Adams. And here you can see that the image is being balanced by the tones that are in the mountain, but they're being offset then by the balance in the lake, the reflection of that bright white tone in the lake. If you imagined that this lake here wasn't in the photograph, you'd find that your eyes were only drawn to the top part of the shot because they're so bright. This is just reflecting so much light. It's picking up so much light that this would just become, you wouldn't look at it, so there'd be nearly no point in including it in the photograph. But here we've got a balance here between the two, because we've got this bright tone here in the lower part of the photograph as well, helping just to make our eyes go over the entire photograph. And balance can also be very subtle as well. I absolutely love this photograph. But here we can see that, we've got this kind of dark tree here at the bottom. We've a lot of space here in the photograph. There's a huge amount of space here in the shot. But we're kind of gradually being led up to the shot because of this lovely natural gradient. And we literally have a full stop here with the moon at the top. So our eyes go right up to that, and there's a nice kind of diagonal here happening as well between the tree and between the moon. So this is a really good example of using balance subtly. It's a trickier one to get used to, and I think if you follow the rule of thirds as a good guideline to start with, you'll find that a lot of your photographs should have a natural balance to them if you stick with that rule. But if you ever find yourself looking at a photograph and kind of wondering that something's a little bit off, you might find that it's just lacking balance. Now, I mentioned it in the first lesson. One of the tips I gave you was to explore and to not just photograph things, just from your own height, to move around and to change your point of view. Now, point of view is not the same as angle of view. So angle of view is when we're speaking about what our lenses can see. It's that range, that degree of view that our lenses can see. Point of view is simply where we're looking, essentially. So, obviously we can see here the photographer's gone very, very low to get this unique point of view of this dog. But let's have a look at some other examples. So here, just by simply looking up, we get this tremendous point of view of these redwood trees. I think they are. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's just a unique way of looking at things. We get this great kind of pattern here. Our eyes are being led through into the center. Again, you've kind of got these leading lines bringing us through to the center of that photograph. And, this can only be achieved by looking up. And looking up can also kind of have a message to it as well. So if you ever want to learn about composition from just one photographer, Alexander Rodchenko would be the person to check out. Russian photographer, his angles for his photography just were so unique, and there was a lot of meaning behind them as well. So you should definitely check out Alexander Rodchenko. But have a look at this photograph, and what do you think when you look at this shot? Okay, so what kind of feeling do you get from this person when you look at this photograph? Now, very often students, kind of say to me, there's kind of a melancholy to this girl's face and that. But I think that it's powerful. I think that she looks very, very determined. I think that there is a strength to her, and that's really brought out by this angle, by the angle that the photographer Alexander Rodchenko decided to shoot this subject from, this person from. And so do think about that when you're photographing people. If you're photographing them from above or from below, it can really change, I suppose, our perception of this person. Like, so for the example, the opposite then here, we've got somebody lying down on the ground, and this is a very relaxed, playful photograph, and that's what we get when we photograph somebody from above, is that you get this kind of playfulness, you get this relaxed vibe to the shot, especially if it's photographed something against like grass here, where it is kind of this idea of rest and relaxation. So photographing from above can kind of give us that impression, but it can also be a negative thing. If it's done, it can also be kind of like we're looking down on this person, that because we're above this person, that we're actually in this position of power. So you do need to be aware of that as well when photographing people from above. Now, one of the most I suppose recent, I wouldn't say invention, but advances in photography is the use of drones. Now, we really don't go into drone photography in this course, but if you are lucky enough to have a drone, it just offers you a completely unique view of the world. Now, there's a lot of regulations and everything that go alongside flying drones. So, be sure to check if you're, in your own territory, if you're ever thinking about buying one, what the rules are around using them, because a lot of people are using them in places that they're not supposed to be using them. However, if you do happen to get one and you're using it responsibly, you just get these incredible shots that were only ever available to photographers who had the means to get a helicopter to get themselves airborne to get these types of photographs. So drone photography has made aerial photography huge, and it's great. It's great to see these, different ways of seeing the world around us. So that could be an option for you to explore as well. Now, with point of view, point of view can also be, when you're right in the action as well. So here we have a photograph that the photographer has taken holding the camera above their heads. They've used a fisheye lens here. We can very much tell it's a fisheye lens because of that distortion. And we get the sense that we're really in the action. So sometimes if you're struggling to get a photograph or to see anything, just simply raising your camera above your head is a good way to get the shot. And just a quick tip for you as well. This is something that I do, if you are going to photograph at a concert with your phone, is to put it on a 2-second timer. Put it on a delay timer so that you can press it and then you can actually lift it above your head. I always see people trying to stretch and press the shutter button. You don't need to do that. Just put it on a timer and then lift it above your head and get the shot. It makes it a lot easier. But you get this real sense of actually being in the action, rather than if you were standing above this crowd, on a balcony and photographing them, there'd be a little bit of a disconnect there. And when you are photographing children or pets or anything like that, get down to their level. See the world as they see it. If you're photographing from above them, it's just going to make them look really, really small. And again, there'll be kind of a disconnection there. We won't feel like we're actually a part of their world. So here, this is such a cute shot, and it's, just couldn't have been captured, if the photographer was just looming and standing above this child. This way we're right in it, and we make that kind of connection there, and we can kind of feel and see the wonder here, with this child and the bubbles. Now, with this as well, all of our photographs, they don't have to be overly complicated too. Sometimes we can overthink our shots, and sometimes less is more. So do think about simplicity. Think about just having very simple arrangements and compositions, like this photograph here. So this is about as simple as you can get. It's just a flower against a fairly nice pastel background. Now this is really nice because the colors are just, they complement each other so well because they're kind of pastel. But, you know, the composition is kind of central. There's a lot of space here at the top, but it still works. It's just very, very straightforward photograph, but it's very appealing. There's almost a graphic kind of quality to it as well. You know, it's almost a contemporary kind of photograph, but it's the kind of one that you'd also put on your wall. You know, this is the kind of stuff that people hang because it's not overly complex, you know, but it's still very visually appealing. And simplicity, you know, works very, very well when we're doing long exposures. So this is a photograph from a lake in New Zealand, and very, very popular spot for photographers. What you're not seeing in this shot is the amount of photographers that are standing along the shoreline here, capturing probably the exact same photograph. But there's a serenity to this. Simplicity can help give a peacefulness, a harmonious kind of atmosphere and feeling from the shot. And, you know, there's a long exposure been done here as well to get very, very silky effect to the water that just gives this kind of serene atmosphere to the photograph. Now, just a few more of these to go through, just a few more tips. We still have plenty left to cover. We still also need to talk about white balance a little bit later on as well. But some other things to have a look out for are shapes. So when you're out there photographing, you know, go back to your basics in a way and start looking around for different types of shapes. So, for example, in this photograph here, you know, the shape's very, very obvious. We have this circular spiral kind of pattern. Architecture, again, is great for looking out for shapes. Like in this photograph here from the Hong Kong skyline, you know, we've got a lot of triangular square shapes going on here. We've kind of got this like S shape going through it there as well, which just breaks it up a little bit too. So just look out for the most simple things and look out for shapes, and buildings are great for this as well. When you're doing that too, you'll probably also kind of come across a lot of repetition and patterns. So look out for patterns as well. Now, buildings are also great for patterns like in this photograph, but it can also be natural as well. It's like in this shot here from Tulip Fields somewhere in the Netherlands. You know, we get this kind of natural pattern happening, and there's a nice kind of colour happening here in this photograph as well. You can also very much see the rule of thirds in play here and leading lines. So quite a lot going on in that photograph. And patterns can also be, I suppose, what we consider almost mundane objects as well, like these cinema seats. So look out for patterns, you know, in wherever you happen to be as well. And closely associated with patterns is repetition. So repetition is when there is an object that is repeating. So the repetition here in this photograph are the hills. So these misty kind of hills just peeking up above the mist there. So we've kind of got a nice repetition here. It's a bit irregular, you know, because the hills aren't all just in a row, but it still has that quality of repetition. And repetition can be a little bit more straightforward. Like here we have a repetition in the architecture here, in those lights hanging from outside this building. And you can see that we're just being drawn through the photograph by following these lights. And repetition, I suppose, also has this idea of uniformity to it as well. So this is a great photograph here of ballet dancers from Cornel Kappa. Cornel Kappa is Robert Kappa's younger brother, who was a very famous photographer in his own right. But you can see here, you know, there is this kind of repetition in these dancers practicing kind of the same moves. And it's just a wonderful photograph. So look out for patterns and repetition. Now, we saw a little bit earlier as well when we were talking about our rule of thirds about leaving a little bit of space. Now, quite often, designers and indeed photographers will refer to space that's left over as negative space. This doesn't necessarily mean that this is bad space, but it means that it just gives room. It just gives the subject room in the shot. And again, negative space can be quite peaceful, like in this photograph here, where the objects in the shot are only occupying maybe less than 35% of the photograph, maybe less than 30% of the photograph, and the overwhelming majority of the shot actually has nothing in it. But it still works. It's a nice, peaceful photograph, and it makes the focal point very, very obvious in the shot, which is, of course, this boat. But it also kind of, I suppose, gives us a sense of the vastness of the ocean as well. So leave a bit of space. Here's another good example of it. Very, very colourful photograph here of this particular lighthouse. But again, we can see lots and lots of space here over on the right-hand side. So you don't have to fill up everything in the frame. So I hope you found some useful compositional guidelines there. Now, there's obviously so much more than that. Certainly if you have a look online, you're going to come across many, many, many more. We simply just don't have time to go through all of them, because we do also need to have a chat about white balance. So what is white balance? Well, have you ever taken a photograph and it just kind of turns out that the colours seem kind of off or all wrong to you, that they just don't look great? Or that if you ever take a photograph, say indoors, and you're just really unhappy with how the light looks, and that the people that were in the photograph, that their skin tones and everything look all wrong. And it very may well have to do with white balance. So white balance basically refers to the fact that different light sources emit different colour temperatures, and these can cause a colour cast in a photograph. So every light source has a different colour temperature, and white balance is used to correct these colour casts by balancing out the colour. So for example, tungsten light, we'll talk about in a moment, produces very, very yellow kind of light, so skin tones can look very, very kind of yellow underneath it. And colour temperature is measured in kelvins, so you'll often see this K when we're talking about color temperature, and it's referring to kelvins. I suppose the best way to kind of summarize what white balance is if, now some people will know exactly what I'm talking about here, but if you do makeup, you'll know that you're trying to pick the correct shades for your skin tone. So for example, if you say, for example, you have quite red skin, you might pick a kind of makeup that has a little bit of a green tint to it, because it'll balance out your skin tone. So this is almost the exact same idea when it comes to white balance. These settings will kind of balance out any kind of casts that are created by whatever particular light source that we happen to be photographing under. So you can see them here. I won't read them all out, but auto white balance generally will always do a great job for us. The camera will automatically try to figure out, what the lighting source is that we're photographing under, and it will correct for that by using auto white balance. But there are times where it's going to get it wrong, and we need to know how to change it ourselves. But we could also use white balance as a creative tool as well. So while it can remove color casts from our photographs, maybe we actually want to add a particular color cast to a shot to change the mood of the photograph. So let's have a look at some examples of it. So the first thing to kind of understand is that with white balance, as I mentioned, it's trying to balance it out by either adding a warm or a cold tone to the shot. So for example, as you can see here, the tungsten is adding kind of a cool tone to the shot, because tungsten light actually gives off a very warm color. So to offset that, when we choose our tungsten setting, it'll actually give us a cold looking photograph. And similarly with shade. So shade will actually usually give us a very warm looking shot. So to kind of balance that out, when we choose the shade option as our white balance, it's going to add coolness to the photograph. So it gives us the opposite to help balance things out. Let's have a look at some more examples of this to make a little bit more sense of it. So here we have what we would call daylight. So when I refer to daylight, daylight is essentially the exact middle when it comes to our Kelvin temperatures. So kelvins go from 0 to 10,000 kelvins on the scale. And daylight is in the center, and this is white light. This is what we call neutral balanced light. There's no color cast in it, and we can see that very much in this shot. And we know that there's no color cast in it because look at the whites. Look at the neutral tones, look at the greys, look at the blacks. Now, it's probably harder to identify it in the greys and the blacks, but with the whites, you can see that there isn't any particular kind of colour cast to the shot. We don't see any kind of reds or yellows or greens or blue or anything like that in the photograph. So this is a balanced shot. And in general, when we're photographing using the auto white balance, it's striving to get a neutral balance to the image, so it's typically going to fall in and around that kind of daylight preset that's available to us on our cameras. Let's have a look at an example where the white balance needs to be corrected. So here we've got a photograph of an office, and we can see here that we've kind of got fluorescent lighting. Now, fluorescent lighting is a bit of a tricky one because it kind of gives us this kind of aqua-y, kind of blue, kind of green type of cast that should be very much seeable in the photograph. Now, if you're having trouble seeing it, it might be to do with the device that you're watching it on. But there is definitely a colour cast here in the shot. And we can tell that very much because we can see that the white parts of the photograph, they look a little bit cold. So in this case, what we would do is that we would select our fluorescent setting. And this is going to help to correct that light by just warming up the photograph a little bit and neutralizing that coolness. Now, I should have mentioned a little bit earlier that the Kelvin scale, it is a little bit unusual in that lower temperatures, lower color temperatures actually produce warmer looking tones, warmer looking colors, and colder temperatures actually produce bluer and colder lights, like you can see here on the scale. So just in case you're wondering, that is actually correct. We go from warmer tones with lower numbers into higher numbers, which are cooler. Now, we can also use our white balance creatively, as I mentioned. So when we're photographing sunsets, if we're finding that we're not quite getting those deep oranges, those deep yellows or reds that we want, in this particular scene, what we could do is we could actually add our shade preset, because that's actually going to add a little bit of warmth to the photograph. Okay, so if we actually choose the incorrect white balance for a photograph, it can actually change the mood of the shot, and in this particular case it just helps to enhance and add a little bit more red to the photograph, or a little bit more warmth to the shot as creative kind of decision. So we can make that choice as well. Remember that this is a creative decision. It's not maybe technically correct, but we don't always have to be technically correct. We are photographers. We do and have the option to make these kind of creative choices. Finally then, for something like this, we have a much colder color temperature. So snow is in and around 8,000 kelvins. It's very cold looking, as you can see here. And it might be difficult again here to see it, but there's a little bit of a blue hue, a bit of a blue color to this shot. And this is where things can get a little bit subjective. So obviously with snow isn't blue, snow is white. And there is a little bit of blue in the shot. And we might decide then, well, that's okay because I want this coldness to come through in the photograph. It's a picture of snow, but technically, again, it's not correct. So here we would probably very much be using something like daylight temperature to correct that. And you can see here, the difference is quite staggering. So if I just go back there, that's the original photograph. Okay, and it might have looked fine, but when I actually remove that and I add my daylight temperature to it to balance out the light, the colors look much more correct. But again, this is quite subjective. You might prefer the colder version of the shot because it gets across the fact that this is a cold photograph, this is a cold place, compared to this one here, which is still a nice photograph, but it's maybe just become a little less interesting. So again, these are decisions that you need to make, with your composition as well. You also need to consider the colors in your shots.